at least we're not incentivizing them. Like, even if it doesn't disincentivize, it doesn't incentivize.
We just want to welcome everybody tonight. We're honored to have Rachel Moran here. I go way back with her years ago. She was an ARD for me, so it's nice to see her here and all grown up. Here, that's right now. We're just going to open in prayer real quick, and then we'll get started. So, Lord, we just thank you for this time. We thank you for bringing Rachel here safely, Lord God, and we just pray that she would be a big blessing on this campus, and she would touch the lives of those who are hearing her speak, Lord God. Pray that you bless this time, and with everything going on in the world with this virus, Lord, we just pray a hedge of protection over this campus and all the students here and all of our families back home. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
So I'm charged with giving a brief introduction. I first met Rachel out in Denver 4 or 5 years ago now, and the first time that we had an opportunity to connect, I'm like, she's super impressive. Like, Rachel, you have to, when's the last time you were on campus? Haven't been back. You have to get back. She grew up in the Buffalo area. When are you coming home? But she was always coming home when we were on break. So I kept pushing over the last couple of years, find a time to get here. And despite everything that's going on, the planes were empty today. She made it from Minneapolis. It's great. So when I met Rachel, she was a clinical fellow in the Criminal Defense Clinic at the University of Denver Stern College of Law. Did such a great job there that she was recruited away and now serves as an associate professor and founder of the Criminal and Juvenile Defense Clinic at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, right down in downtown Minneapolis. And here's an opportunity for her to take what she learned, she'll tell you more about it as well, in Denver, and grow and create a program and do it very, very well in Minneapolis. What I appreciate about Rachel is her heart. So she is for the underdog. She is for the marginalized. She is committed to helping people in their time of need and applying what she learned here at Houghton and in law school, and really coming to the aid of people who might not otherwise get the vigorous defense that they need. So without further ado, I will let Rachel tell you some of her story tonight, and we welcome lots of questions along the way. Rachel, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Carl. Sorry it took me so long to get back. Hi, Dr. Marlander. I was a political science major when I was at Houghton. I minored in Spanish and communications, and it prepared me really well for law school. After I graduated from here in 2005, I went straight to law school in Chicago. Graduated from there and then practiced as a public defender in Chicago for 7 years, mostly working with kids charged as adults with serious violent crimes. So my, some variety there, but my primary clients were kids who were in the 14 to 17 age range and were were mostly charged with murder and facing the possibility of life sentences. So it was fairly intense work. And then after that, as Carl noted, I went to Denver, taught there for a few years, and now I'm an assistant professor at University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis. We just shut down as of today, so here I am in person, not socially distancing myself. It's nice to be with all of you. At St. Thomas, so Carl mentioned I founded the Criminal and Juvenile Defense Clinic. What that means is that I work with law students actually representing people accused of crimes. So it's totally free, of course. I'm teaching the law students, so I'm also a classroom teacher. But the practical training component of this is that we represent real people, mix of kids and adults, sometimes charged with offenses ranging from traffic offenses to first-degree murder and a lot in between. And I supervise them as they learn how to represent people. But I want to start my story further back. I grew up as a white child in a middle-class suburb of western New York, so innocuous that it was named the safest city in America 3 years in a row when I was in elementary and middle school. When I was in high school, one of my friends dated a guy caught selling marijuana at school, and it was the biggest scandal the church youth group had probably ever known. But other than that, I did not have a lot of interaction with people accused of crimes. Then I came here. The most serious violent crime I encountered here was when I was driving along Route 19 in my mom's very small VW Bug, and a deer jumped out of the side of the road and attacked the car and implanted its hoof prints, broke off my side view mirror and implanted its hoofs into the hood of the car. But other than that and a couple exciting incidents I was just reminiscing with Michelle about as an ARD, my time here was fairly peaceful as well. I was 24 years old and in my second year of law school when I went to the criminal courthouse in Chicago for the first time. I sat down with another law student, and our assignment was just to watch court for an hour. And we sat in the gallery where the mostly families of people who were accused of crimes were sitting. And it took me a little while to notice, but it eventually dawned on me that my fellow student and I were the only white people in the gallery. And then they started bringing out the defendants, as they're known, who were accused of crimes. And over the course of the hour, all of the people who were accused of crimes who were brought out from the lockup area behind the courtroom were all people of color. And I watched them get brought in front of the judge and arraigned on charges of certain crimes. And as I watched this parade happen over the course of an hour, it was obvious to me that something was deeply wrong with what I was watching. But it was also obvious to me that I didn't know enough about the situation to pinpoint exactly how we'd gotten here or to fix the problem. I couldn't have told you much of anything about the men who I was watching. I couldn't have told you about the neighborhoods they grew up in or the schools they were educated in or the political and social influences that brought the attention of law enforcement to these men in their neighborhoods, or the myriad of other problems that might have caused the situation that I was witnessing. So I realized in that moment that despite my great Houghton education, I still had a lot to learn. And it is over a decade since that time, and I still have a lot to learn. But here's what I can now say with confidence. This is an opinion, of course, but based on a lot of experience, which is that our criminal justice system is routinely unjust. We pay not enough attention to the individual people who we are moving through our system. Our judges and prosecutors and even defense attorneys like myself often do not have the sufficient time or resources to pay the people the attention that their humanity actually calls for, that they deserve. We are a nation that is obsessed with punishment to the extent that we incarcerate a higher rate of our people than any other country in the world. In a nation that too often doesn't think strategically about the systemic causes for the crimes we are punishing so harshly. We too often devalue the lives of the poor, those who are suffering from mental illness, and those whose skin color does not fit our stereotypes of prosperity and legality. And as Christians, sometimes we are naive occasionally to the struggles of the world. Sometimes we just haven't encountered them ourselves, like when I was watching that courtroom for the first time. Occasionally, unfortunately, we don't care because we don't see those people in ourselves. And sometimes we just distance ourselves. Some of you may have heard of a man named Brian Stevenson. He's probably the most well-known civil rights criminal defense attorney in the U.S. today. He wrote the book Just Mercy, and the movie recently came out, also titled Just Mercy. It's great, it's worth seeing. But he's a Christian, which is not often discussed. He's incredibly well-known. He's a Christian. And the way he phrases, so he spent 30 years representing people on death row, mostly in Alabama. And what he talks about is, he talks about how his life changed when he became proximate to suffering. That's the phrase he uses. So I want to attribute that phrase to him, but borrow it just for a little bit in the talk today, and just share 3 stories of people who have changed my life and lessons I've learned as I had the privilege of getting proximate to my client's suffering. So lesson number 1, this one's really wordy, I didn't phrase it very well. But if we believe that everyone's created in God's image and equally precious to Him, then we have a responsibility to amplify the voices of people who are traditionally ignored. And the story I want to share is that of a client I represented. These are all stories of my time as a public defender in Chicago, but this particular young man was a 19-year-old client, a 19-year-old black man with cognitive impairments. His IQ was in the low 60s, if I recall, so pretty significant cognitive impairments. And he was charged at age 19 with aggravated vehicular hijacking, which basically just means that he was charged with taking somebody's car at gunpoint. Somebody's eyes just got big. I was not his public defender at the time. When he was originally charged, he had his public defender, the prosecutor, and the judge all believed that the sentencing range for this offense was a minimum of 22 years in prison and a maximum of 45. So the prosecutor offered, well, if he'll plead guilty, we'll give him the minimum sentence, 22 years. And the evidence was pretty strong, and so the public defender talked him into this plea. And the young man who later became my client, he didn't have a real sense of how to move forward or an ability to really articulate that well what he wanted to do. So he accepted the plea. He pled guilty and he was sentenced to 22 years in prison. About 4 years later, after he'd been in prison for 4 years, for reasons I won't bother explaining, I got appointed to represent him. And one of the things I immediately realized after a little bit of research was that the sentencing range at the time of his offenses was actually a minimum of 7 years and a maximum of 22. In other words, he'd been talked into pleading guilty to what was actually the maximum sentence, and he had never been told that. So we filed a very late motion to withdraw his guilty plea, and over the course of the next 2 years, fought all sorts of hurdles trying to get him. All we were trying to get him was a new sentencing opportunity. We weren't actually even trying to get him a trial or anything like that, just an opportunity for a new sentencing. And I got to know my client, but also his mom pretty well over that time. She would call every 2 weeks on the dot, asking me for an update, because it was ridiculous that it was taking as long as it was. She had some cognitive issues too, I think, so it would sometimes be hard for her to understand why things were taking so long. And every 2 weeks, she would just tell me how much she loved her son and how excited she was to have him coming home. And she was sure we were going to win this case and get him home. And we partially won the case. We got him. Finally, after 2 years, we finally got what we were asking for, which was a new sentencing hearing. And she called me on the phone and told me about the shrimp dinner she was going to cook for him because he loved shrimp and he hadn't had it in 6 years now. The day of the resentencing hearing, he got assigned to the original public defender who had represented him. And the day of the sentencing hearing, my client's mom called me on the phone, crying so hard that I had no idea who it even was at first. It was just a woman crying on the phone. And eventually the person calmed down a little bit and was able to say her name, and I asked what happened, and she said, well, she had gathered all of this evidence about his educational records and his low IQ that had not been presented in the original plea agreement, and she had tried to give it to the attorney, and the attorney said, we don't have time for any of this. And the same prosecutor, same judge, same public defender read the resentencing order. There's a ladybug on the microphone. Read the resentencing order and said, well, 22 years is still legally within the term that was allowed. So we're just going to impose the same, we're just going to agree to the same sentence. So the judge reimposed the same 22-year sentence without a hearing, and then when my client realized what had happened and started to get agitated in the courtroom, one of the deputies tackled him and led him away in handcuffs. And that was when the client's mom one of the lessons I learned from that is I hear a lot of people say, and they're totally well-meaning, so I don't want to bash this, but they say they want to be a voice for the voiceless. And I've learned over time that, to dislike that phrase because it's not sufficiently nuanced. Our clients have voices. I've never actually represented someone who is voiceless. What the problem is that we don't listen to their voices. So as Christians, we have a duty to amplify the voices of those who tend not to get heard, the ones who tend to be marginalized. And as a lawyer, I carry that same duty. As a Christian lawyer, it's my privilege to amplify the voices of the people who are often not heard and silenced, but not voiceless. Lesson number 2, everyone's redeemable. See, that was a short one. But I represented a lot of kids who were charged with murder, and that's a wild thing to experience over and over and over again. We as a nation are currently grappling with how do we sentence people who are under age 18 when they're convicted of serious crimes. Some of my clients were definitely guilty, some of them were not. Some of them I will never know. That's not really the point of what I'm sharing. What I want to say is a lot of times sometimes I got to know them at age 14 to 17. Sometimes I got to know them many years later when they were trying to appeal their convictions or sentences and they were in their mid-20s or your age. And they're not the same people that they were when they were 14 or 15 or 16 or 17. Just like you're not the same people even a few years later. Some of my clients made terrible decisions because they were in situations that I'd never encountered when I was growing up in the safest city in America. Some of them were trying to impress older teenagers or adults. Some of them were getting coerced into situations. And some of them were probably innocent, but their claims were never properly heard. Regardless, though, they weren't the same people at age 25 or 30 or 22 as they were when those things happened. And most of them were serving life in prison. I don't pretend to know, I certainly have opinions that I could share later, but I don't pretend to say my opinion is the only correct one about how to deal with complicated situations like that or how kids like that should be treated. But I get asked a lot as a defense attorney, how do you defend people you know are guilty? I'm preempting that. It was going to come, so I'm just preempting it. And Christians ask that more often than non-Christians, and that really bothers me. Because the central premise of the Christian faith is belief in a God who knew our guilt and advocated for us anyway. And I am not pretending that earthly justice and divine mercy are exactly the same thing. I'm not saying that that's a perfect comparison. I'm certainly not comparing my job as a defense attorney to the sacrificial atonement that Christ made. But the reality, what is significant about the truth that God knew our sin and died for us anyway, and advocates to the Father on the throne for us despite our sin. What's significant about that is that God doesn't give up on people. Everyone is redeemable. And I think that has to inform, in some way, how we as Christians think about situations like, what do we do with kids who've committed really serious crimes? What do we do even with adults who have committed really serious crimes? Is it appropriate that we, as a country, have some of the harshest sentencing schemes in the world? And I think that whether you go into law or not, it's your responsibility to be thinking about those issues. Lesson number 3. God's call to participate in the reconciliation of society is not limited to people in, I'll put quotes around this, full-time ministry. I have never felt any call, any desire, any need to go into something that could be classified as vocational ministry the way it's traditionally understood. But I have sometimes wondered, and I did wonder earlier in my career, actually wrestle with this quite a bit, the question of, am I somehow not spending my time as well because I'm not doing work that is explicitly evangelical. When I had been, so here's another story. So when I had been a public defender for about a year, I got assigned to a case of a man who, at age 19, 12 years earlier, had been charged with and convicted of first-degree murder. And I'll give you a little bit of background about that case. He was a 19-year-old drug dealing in a poor neighborhood in Chicago. And there was an unsolved murder. About 2 weeks after the murder, a 15-year-old girl came to the police and said, if you let me, she had a brother in jail. She said basically, like, if you do a favor for him, I'll tell you who committed this murder. They did the favor. She named my eventual client, whose name is Al. I'll give you his name because there's actually a lot of information about him available publicly. But she said Al committed the murder. I saw it. She was 15. She said she saw the murder from the steps of the housing project she was sitting on at 2 o'clock in the morning from half a block away while she was braiding hair with a friend. And what she described is that Al had chased a man into the alley and shot the man in the back as the man was fleeing into the alley. There were no other eyewitnesses presented at trial. There was no forensic evidence except for a medical examiner's testimony who said the person was shot from less than an inch away in the chest. So it seems to contradict the story. The defense attorney presented no witnesses or evidence, and that was enough for the jury to convict. So Al was convicted of first-degree murder based on that alone. Shortly after he was convicted, he filed what's called a post-conviction petition, which is a request for the court to hear new evidence. And he said, there were 5 witnesses that should have been called to trial. 2 of them were my alibi witnesses who would have said I was somewhere else at the time of the offense. 2 of them were eyewitnesses to the shooting who did see the shooting and say it's not me. And 1 of them was sitting with the girl braiding hair at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, we heard shots fired, but we couldn't see anything. So he had affidavits from those 5 people. And then he also had a claim, which turned out to be true, that his appointed attorney at trial had previously represented the murder victim, which is not appropriate. So he filed that post-conviction petition. So he was convicted in 1998. He filed the post-conviction petition in 1999. I became a licensed attorney in 2009, so there's a long span there. He was represented by 5 public defenders. The first 4 didn't do anything on the case. They just kind of got passed around. And then the 5th one actually did a bunch of work, turned the petition into a pretty readable format because Al had initially filed it by himself. And then left the office to become a judge, and the 6th attorney took over and didn't know what was going on, and there was a hearing scheduled on the petition, and the attorney couldn't articulate anything in the petition, and the case just got dismissed. And then I was in the appellate division at the time, so it came to me. So my client had been incarcerated for 12 or 13 years by then. And I remember actually very vividly where I was in my office when I got that file and started reading it, because in the first 5 pages, I would say, I just thought, I am representing an innocent man who's been in prison for 13 years. And I have to get him out. But this is going to be a challenge. The first time I called Al on the phone, I don't actually recommend, this is probably a too abrupt approach for someone who's spent that much time in prison, but I called him, and he was obviously wary of me. I was like the 7th attorney in his case, and they'd all been terrible. I just said, and we were on the phone, we never even met in person, and I just said, well, I don't know how to break the ice except to say that I'm terribly sorry for the way you've been treated. I think you're innocent, and I'm going to fight to get you out. And he started crying. And in that moment, I think, it became a little more real to me even, because he was crying on the phone, and I was trying to imagine what it would So I represented Ale for the next, 6-ish years. We got him a new hearing after quite a lot of fight, and then I left to go to Denver, and a firm graciously agreed to take over the case, a large law firm, to handle it pro bono with me, just consulting from a distance. And so they're the ones who actually got him out of prison, not me. But in 2017, he was finally released from prison. And as a side note, the woman who was representing him went on to become Chicago's mayor, and I found out, I knew Elle had been released, but I saw him again last year on my Twitter feed when he was doing an ad for her, talking about how he had been so hopeless and down in the dumps until she came along to represent him. And I was like, Elle! I actually was there first. But I'm totally kidding. There's no reason at all to credit. What's important about this story, a few things. I didn't actually do anything remarkable in this story. I did literally what my job was when other people had failed. But the remarkable person is the man who spent that much time in prison and endured it with a level of grace and resilience that I can't fathom, and who is now putting his life back together afterward. But when Scripture talks about participating in the reconciliation of all people to himself, yes, that means we should be participating in eternal reconciliation, but I don't think it stops there, and sometimes it can be easy to shortchange the work that God cares about here on earth. And I like to think, as a lawyer doing criminal defense, I have a marvelous opportunity every day to participate in the reconciliation of society by seeing people who tend to get ignored and marginalized and caring deeply about them, and also working hard for them. So right before I open up for questions, I just want to read a quote that I was really impressed by. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Gospel in a Pluralistic Society. It's authored by a man named Leslie Newbegin. It's not new at all. He wrote it a while ago. But this is an excerpt that speaks to the responsibilities. He's talking about the responsibilities that Christians bear while we are here on earth. It's not specific to lawyers, but here's what he says. The gospel offers an understanding of the human situation, which makes it possible to be filled with a hope that is both eager and patient, even in the most hopeless situations. If the gospel is to challenge the public life of our society, that will only happen as and when local congregations renounce an introverted concern for their own life and recognize that they exist for the sake of those who are not members, as sign, instrument, and foretaste of God's redeeming grace for the whole life of society. That's all I have. I want to give us space for questions. So, should I stand here for questions?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Sure.
How have you handled just, I guess, the idea of, and maybe even coming face to face with some of the other like defense lawyers and stuff that don't do their job as well as they may be able to, and in some cases, obviously, like it's not intentional. It's sometimes there's things that stand in their way, or just other reasons that they fail to do their job properly. But just how do you deal with that, knowing that if somebody had done their job better, that these people would be better off?
Yeah, can people hear the question? The question was how do I deal with when other public defenders or other attorneys don't do a good enough job, and knowing the impact that could have on clients, essentially. Is that a fair characterization? Yeah. I mean, actually, so I hope I didn't portray myself as the only hero in this battle, because I think the better question is, how do I deal with the question of am I doing enough work? Because there is a lot of there's a lot that goes into this. The work is always available and can be endless. So I have dealt with this question in the context of things like working too much or too hard. What are my responsibilities to people when, and in the context of my whole life? when I could be doing better work, or there have also been times where I can look back on something and say, I was the one who didn't, maybe not, it was never out of lack of effort, I don't think, but not having thought of a situation, especially in like in the moment of a trial when things are happening around you. I don't mean to shortchange your question. I just want to say the first one is really for myself. How do I deal with situations where I may have not done great work? And I teach a class with my students. It's just one class, not a whole course, but on managing professional anxiety. And we talk about what sort of healthy balance are we trying to achieve so that we can be emotionally present and invested in our cases, but not burning out on either end of the spectrum, so either emotionally distancing ourselves in an unhelpful way, or so present that my emotional well-being is dependent on the outcome of the case. In terms of, so that, I know that's not like a solutions answer, I'm just acknowledging that this is a real tricky thing to navigate. In terms of other people, that's why I went into teaching. So I love being a public defender and could have done it for my whole career without, could have loved it the whole time. But I was frustrated enough with the system and the way people were being trained that I decided to try my hand at teaching. So that's how I dealt with that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So I heard this is a little while back when I was listening to this report, but I heard that the public defender area is really there's a big shortage of them. Like at the extreme, and again this was kind of just as an extreme, but like in one county I think actually it wasn't Alabama, they only had they were supposed to only have 150 cases each attorney a year, but they ended up doing over 1,000 a year. Would you say that I'm not thinking that that's represent everywhere we're out in the country, but would you say generally speaking that would there be if there's been a big shortage and it's been getting worse, or if there was a shortage and it's been getting better, or that was incorrect?
It's absolutely correct. It's nationwide, and it's not that there's a shortage of people who want to become public defenders. It's actually a very competitive job to get nowadays, which is different than 20 or 30 years ago. It's a funding issue. So it's states or counties, or there are different jurisdictions and different practices for how they fund public defenders, but it's very much a funding issue. They will not pay the money to have appropriate caseloads. And it's also worth, I think, considering almost every jurisdiction pays prosecutors more than public defenders. And that's would be an interesting conversation to have. But that's not to say that prosecutors don't take too many cases. They generally do as well, but they are getting paid more and oftentimes requiring less individualized work on each case. So it's a huge national problem. It's one governments know about and do not, for the most part, care to change. Thanks for asking all this. Sounds like you've done some thought into that. Yes?
You mentioned specifically how a jury specifically ruled a certain case with the evidence completely, it wasn't, you didn't have enough evidence for that case. The jury didn't have enough evidence for the case that you mentioned. I don't know how the jury process is actually selected, but how are members of a jury selected, and if there isn't a minimum, I don't know, some logic that
So the question was, how are juries selected? Has anyone ever been on a jury? So that's one interesting thing. So in the room, no one at least admits being on a jury. A lot of people